All right, we're ready for Proverbs 9 and 10. We're going to shift gears between 9 and 10. And if you have studied Proverbs in the past, which hopefully you have, you'll recognize and know what we're talking about. If this is your first verse-by-verse kind of study through Proverbs, then there's going to be an abrupt change in chapter 10. And we'll talk about that when we get there. So anyway, let's review where we've been. Chapter 1 of Proverbs was about what wisdom will and will not do. Chapter 2, we have to seek after wisdom, go after it and search for it. Chapter 3, we search for it because of its value, the value of wisdom. It's valuable because wisdom is, chapter 4, the principal theme. Chapter 5, and how many more chapters go with that as a unit of chapters? 5, 6, and 7. And one of the primary thoughts of 5, 6, and 7 is a warning about sexual immorality, the strange woman, the harlot. And so chapter 5 is what I meant by raising that question. Yeah, sexual immorality and marital faithfulness. Chapter 6 dealt with a multiple of things. Dealt with what? Warnings of wisdom, one of which is warning about this harlot. Chapter 7, last time. Warnings about the strange woman. And then chapter 8. Wisdom's invitation to excellent things. Now, chapter 9 is an outgrowth of chapter 8. Much the same principle that we see in chapter 8. So, what we have in chapter 9 is, by the way, let me stop right here. This is our outline of the book. We're shifting gears from 9 to chapter 10 in just a moment. And chapters 1 through 9 are much the same format. Chapters 10 to 31 are much the same format, and we'll talk about that distinction a little bit later. But here's our outline of chapter 9. Chapter 9 I simply call the invitation of wisdom and her rival folly. This is not the first picture we have of this, but it is clearly pictured in the 9th chapter that wisdom is personified as this woman who has prepared this great feast, and she's inviting people to come to her feast, partake of her wisdom. And here is folly, pictured much like a harlot, though the emphasis of chapter 9 is not on that immoral woman, but much like a harlot, she is inviting someone to evil, to foolishness. And so here is folly, this woman folly, is inviting you to come to her feast. Here is wisdom inviting you to come to her feast. And that's the contrast in chapter 9. So wisdom is invitation to the feast, folly is invitation to the feast, is what we have in chapter 9. Here's what I learned from chapter 9. When we just go through chapter 9 and either we skim through it quickly or we do a detailed study, when we get at the end of chapter 9, here's one of the conclusions I have to draw. We're always going to be at a crossroads. You're at a crossroads right now. You'll be at a crossroads tomorrow. In every decision you make, you're standing at a crossroad. And am I going to go to this feast or am I going to go to this feast? It's like walking down the road and wisdom is on this side of the street and she's inviting you to come and folly's over here. And which one do I want to go to? Which feast do I want to eat? And so we're at a crossroads at all times, at every day, every moment. And we've got to make a choice. We can't eat of both feasts. We're going to choose one or the other. Make sense? All right. Let's go to our questions now for today. Question number 1. What does wisdom invite, or who does wisdom invite to her feast? All right. Yeah, those who are naive, those who are simple. Verse 4. In other words, those who are impressionable. She invites those who are willing to live. She invites all. But later in chapter 9, we're going to see the foolishness of insisting some people come to the feast because they have no appreciation for the feast at all. Does that make sense? Don't cast your pearls before swine. We'll see that a little bit later in the context. Question number 2, who listens to wisdom? Chapter 9. All right? Verse 8, verse 9, verse 12. The wise are going to listen to this woman called wisdom. Let's get question 3, verses 13 to 18, concerning folly. Who does she invite? Yeah, there are people passing by. They seem to be in a hurry. We'll say more about the significance of that. And all who pass by, she invites. And what does she invite them to do? Question 4. Yeah, the forbidden pleasures, someone said. The forbidden pleasures, she invites them to that. All right, let's make our way through this chapter. Here's the first part of verses 1 to 12. Wisdom prepares a feast and she invites the simple. So I want you to notice 3 things in verses 1 to 6. First, she sets her feast, and so she's got everything prepared. Let's get the picture. Wisdom built her house. She's hewn it out of 7 pillars. That may suggest the idea of completeness, that there's an abundance or an abounding of blessings. Nothing is lacking, suggesting maybe stability with wisdom. She has this house of 7 pillars. What else has she done? Verses 1 and 2. There's an abundance of feast, isn't it? She slaughtered her meat. She has her feast spread. And so it's picturing again this woman that has this house she has had built. It's of 7 pillars. She's got her meat and her wine, and her table is furnished. And so everything is prepared. There is this humongous feast at her house. And so wisdom is inviting you to come. Come and partake of the feast, which is wisdom itself. Now in verses 3 and 4, and I don't have this subdivided here, but the second point in verses 1 to 6 is that she calls and invites and begs people to come. So let's look at verse 3. She sends out her maidens, and she cries from the highest place in the city, "Whoever is simple, let him turn in here, and he who lacks understanding," she says to him, "Come and eat of my bread." And we'll come back to verse 5 here in just a second. Who's she inviting? Is she downplaying the people who will come to her feast? I want simple, stupid people to come. Is that what she's saying? The idea of the simple, or the one who lacks understanding, is the person who is willing to listen and who is impressionable. Does that make sense? And we're going to see that in chapter 10, that same principle demonstrated. Who's willing to listen to wisdom, who isn't. But in other words, those who are willing to listen, those who are impressionable. And notice at verse 5, "Come and eat of the bread and drink of the wine that we have mixed, and forsake foolishness and live and go in the way of understanding." So here's what you get and here's what you gain. So 3 things have happened. She prepared this feast. She invites people to come. And in the invitation for people to come, I'm learning there is access to this feast. There's no excuse. And we'll get to the third point in a second. That's a powerful point. That when someone lacks understanding and they don't have wisdom, there is no excuse for that because wisdom invited you to the feast. That's like walking down the road and wisdom says there's a free feast here. You don't want you to come and eat, and you walk away and say, "I'm still hungry." That's your fault. You didn't partake of the feast. It was there. It was accessible. It was available, and you didn't go in and eat. Don't complain about being hungry. When you're lacking wisdom and you lack understanding and you've had access to the feast, it's your fault. Had every opportunity. Now here's the third thing at verse 6. Here's what you gain. You gain 2 things. What are they? You come and eat of this feast and you'll have, number 1, life, and number 2, understanding. You want to live, you want to have life, and you want to have understanding. Come and eat of this feast. Now, in order to do that, look at verse 6. What do you have to do? First line. You've got to turn your back on something. Again, picture the street, and here's foolishness on one side and wisdom on the other, and she's inviting you to your feast. For me to go in here, I've got to turn my back on foolishness. Does that make sense? When I turn my back or turn toward foolishness, I've turned my back on wisdom. So you've got to turn your back on something. You got to turn your back on foolishness. And I don't want that. I don't want foolishness. I don't want sin. I don't want that. I want to go in the way of righteousness. Now let's start at verse 7 now. And verse 7 simply says, the wise will listen and the fools will not. This is a section that it's making this point. I want us to see this point first. Who's going to turn in there? Well, people of wisdom who have some sense of wisdom and want wisdom, they're going to turn into this feast. That's part of the point. But I think it's advice from wisdom that she's giving advice saying, basically, don't cast your pearls before swine. Does that make sense? Don't cast your pearls before swine. In other words, don't waste your time trying to get people to have wisdom who have no interest in wisdom. Now let's see what she says. Verse 7. He who reproves a scoffer gets shame for himself, but he who rebukes the wicked man gets himself a blemish. What's that about? All right. Good point. What else? Wisdom is not appealing to the scoffer. He has no interest in that. And furthermore, it may be making the point that the scoffer is not willing to make a change. They see the principle of wisdom and they just scoff and they ridicule. Has no interest in that at all. Doesn't do any good. So read let's just glance through verses 7, 8, and 9 just quickly and see if it's not basically saying, if you're interested in this feast, don't waste your time trying to bring someone in with you who is balking and scoffing and ridiculing because they're not interested in this feast. They're only going to ridicule this feast. And so if you reprove a scoffer, you bring shame to yourself. Do not reprove a scoffer, verse 8, lest he hate you. Rebuke a wise man and he'll love you. In other words, here's a person who wants wisdom and you invite them to go into the feast with you. They're going to appreciate that. The scoffer will not. So give wisdom to the wise and he'll be wiser still. The person who's wise wants more wisdom. The scoffer doesn't want any wisdom. And so they ridicule and they're not willing to listen to that. Now let's begin at verse 10 and see what 10 to 12 has to say. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. What does that mean? All right. How is the fear of the Lord the beginning of wisdom? All right.
Benefit from it, and God accepts everyone that wants Him. You got to want to go to the Lord before He will accept you.
All right. Good point.
I think it's the idea of Him, the man understanding He is the designer and the creator.
Yeah.
Designer and creator. You've got to get that in your mind. And once you get that established in your mind, then you can go on to it.
Absolutely. The person who has fear of God in their heart, they first of all have reverence and respect for who God is the person that will seek out wisdom from God. It is the beginning of wisdom. And so at the very foundation, here's someone who says, I want wisdom, but I don't have any respect for God or anything He says. You're never going to have wisdom. Never going to have it. That seems to be the point. Let's drop down to verse 12. If you're wise for yourself. What does that mean? All right, self-preservation. If you gain wisdom, the first one to benefit from wisdom is yourself. Does that make sense? He's just mentioned in the context of seemingly inviting others to go to the feast with you. So it's not just wisdom that you gain that you help others, but wisdom, first of all, benefits yourself. And it benefits others around you, but it benefits yourself first. And so wisdom invites you to this feast. Here's who comes and here who will not. Now, folly has a feast as well. Beginning at verse 13. The foolish woman is clamorous. The English Standard says she's loud. She's boisterous, your footnote will say. Wisdom doesn't have to be loud and boisterous. It just quietly invites. She's loud. She's boisterous. She's simple and doesn't know anything. She sits in the high places and invites, and she calls all those who pass by who go straight in on their way. King makes an observation in his work on Proverbs, his thorough work on Proverbs, that seems to be making the point they're passing by and they're in a hurry, and she's trying to get their attention. They're passed by and they're on their way. And whoever's simple, she invites him to come in, and the one who lacks understanding, she says to him, now notice verse 17, stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. What do you take from that? All right, yeah, there's forbidden pleasures that's involved. I want to come back to that. But do you see a contrast in the feast? Wisdom is offering you a feast of slaughtered meat and wine and a furnished table. And folly invites you to a feast, and she's got bread and water. So what's appealing about the bread and water? This is stolen water. And the bread's eaten in secret. What do you make of that? Just the thing Jeanette just mentioned, it deals with this perhaps forbidden pleasure. Grass is always greener on the other side. This is something that's forbidden to you. This is stolen water. Now that's appealing. Now I can eat meat over there, but everybody can have meat. But this is stolen water. This is exciting. This is bread we have to eat in secret lest we get caught. That's exciting. I know it's just bread. This is slaughtered meat. But this is exciting. Grass is greener on the other side. Always. Any comments or questions on that? Yeah. I think, yeah, exactly. It's empty promises, but the person passing by is attracted by that. And the point of the context is, you can go have this fine feast with wisdom, or you're going to get emptiness. You're not going to have nothing but bread and water, and it's not quite the feast that she's making it out to be, but you're going to go to that, and here's what's going to happen. Look at verse 18. It's going to end ultimately in death, and it carries you down the path of death into the dead. That's the realm of the dead, and then her guests are in the depths of hell, that is in Sheol or in Hades. Now, for what it's worth, just a little bit of trivia and footnote. You say, well, that's the end of Proverbs 18, and it is. But quite interesting, the Septuagint translation adds the following. That which is in blue has been added. Notice over here in the Lexham edition of that, it goes 18 and 18a and 18b and 18c. And King, who is a scholar in Hebrew, suggests that that's not in the text. It's not in a Hebrew text. But it ended up in the Septuagint. It doesn't teach any error, but it just basically, they think that some scribe thought that this was not a good ending to the chapter, that folly has the last word as we break from chapters 9 to 10, and wisdom needs to have her invitation. And so wisdom would be saying, but hurry off and do not tarry, nor fix your eyes toward her, that you may cross the strange water. In other words, wisdom basically saying, get away from her, get away from this folly, and listen to wisdom. It's just an interesting tidbit. You're not going to be edified by that. It's just an interesting tidbit that the Septuagint added a little bit to that. Questions or comments on chapter 9 before we go to chapter 10? Yes, sir. Yeah, a person that's interested in wisdom and has wisdom, they want even more wisdom. That's a very good point. And they're seeking more wisdom. And the just man will increase in his learning. He just wants to know more. I want to learn more. The fool doesn't need wisdom. I'm not interested in wisdom. And you try to teach him wisdom, he rebels against that. But not the wise man. He wants to know even more. I want to learn more wisdom. Good point. Practical things you learn from chapter 9 you want to take home with you.
You always have a choice, good and evil, or make it result. There's always like a decision, like you said. And you're going to always be enticed by the devil, which is walking around to and fro on earth like a roaring lion. So he's also in that place where she's at, lurking there with you.
Yeah.
To see you and take your soul if you can.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Take the right path.
Got to take the right path. All right, let's move on to chapter 10. Now we shift gears because chapters 1 through 9 is basically, chapter 9 is a good summary of chapters 1 to 9. That there's wisdom and there's folly, and you're being invited to either feast. Take your choice, which one you're going to choose. Now starting in chapter 10, we shift gears in the nature of the book. It has a different rhyme. It has a different rhythm of reading. It's just different. And what we have starting in chapter 10 is just a collection of miscellaneous verses where the first verse and the second verse may not relate at all directly, other than these are collections of wisdom. So there's 2 or 3 things I want to suggest about that. One is if this is your first real serious study of this, you say, well, this is hard to outline. And so may I make this suggestion to you. If you're making your own outlines, which I always suggest, what this outline will reflect is I look at the Proverbs. You take chapter 10 or chapter 12, chapter 15, any one of these chapters. That it is a pile of verses that are unrelated necessarily. And you start going through the pile and you pick out a verse. This one deals with the tongue. Put it over here in this category of the tongue. Here's another one that deals with laziness. Let's put it over here in another category of laziness. And so you might have verse 1, verse 8, verse 15, verse 25, all talking about the same thing. Does that make sense? And then you might have verse 2, verse 7, and verse 14 dealing with the same thing. And so we group them together, and I would suggest you do that and then make some marginal notes in your Bible. And what I find is when I'm looking for some information on the tongue, for example, and I can't remember all the Proverbs, I go through page by page. What verses deal with the tongue? Well, I'm going to look at verse 11, 18 to 21, 31, 32 here. Go to the next chapter, and it may only be 2 verses. The next one may be 5. And I want to look for laziness. Is this chapter, maybe this chapter doesn't deal with laziness. I'm going to look for categories of things. Second thing I suggest you do, and that I think you'll find this helpful, there's so much information in these chapters, we can't thoroughly cover every point. But pick out some verses that stand out in your mind you want to remember. Underline those or highlight those. And those are key proverbs you want to take note of. Not every proverb is going to be highlighted. For example, in chapter 10, you might take verse 19, in the multitude of words, sin is not lacking, and he refrains his lips is wise. That's a good proverb. And so you might want to highlight that or underline that and pick out key proverbs, 2 or 3 out of each chapter, that these are ones I want to remember when we get through. Does that make sense? All right. So let's get underway. We're going to look at this not verse by verse, but by categories. And I think this will make more sense to us. So what I've done is gone through, it's like taking a pile of clothes, and here's the men's, and let's put them all together, and the women's and the children, and then over here in the men's, I've separated shirts and pants, and so I've got them kind of organized. That's what we've done here. The pile of verses, and now we've kind of separated them out. So here's the piles. Let's go through the piles. Let's talk about righteousness versus the wicked. Now let's subdivide that pile of righteousness. So we're going to hit some high points. So we're not starting with verse 1, we're going to start with verse 2. There is a contrast all through, and this is going to be in every chapter. There will be a contrast of righteousness versus wickedness. And we'll come to our questions in a moment. But let's start with whether or not righteousness is profitable or not profitable. So he makes this contrast. Look at verse 2. We got verse 2 and 3 together. The treasures of wickedness profit nothing, but righteousness delivers from death. The Lord will not allow the righteous soul to famish, and he cast away the desires of the wicked. What do we learn from that? Those two verses. All right, wickedness doesn't help you at all. That's what I've learned. Righteousness will. There's profit from righteousness. That's basically what we learn. Drop down to verse 16. The labor of the righteous leads to life. The wages of the wicked to sin. You fall after righteousness, you're going to have life. And I take it because of the contrast, that life has to do with a right relationship with God. But wickedness going to carry you to being separated from God. So righteousness is profitable, wickedness is not. All right, let's go further. Look at verse 6 now. Being blessed or not blessed. Blessings are on the head of the righteous, but violence covers the mouth of the wicked. What does that suggest to you? If you're righteous, there's blessings, but the wicked have a mouth of violence. It's filled with wrong information, wrong saying, wrong things that are uttered. Violence is coming forth from their mouth. There's not any blessing in that. Verse 22, just drop down to verse 22. The blessing of the Lord makes one rich, and he adds no sorrow with it. Number of Proverbs, I don't think these Proverbs are saying you follow the Lord, you're going to be mega wealthy. You follow the principles of righteousness, and you will have the blessings of life. I think that's the point. You're going to be blessed. Verse 24, the fear of the wicked come upon him, and the desire of the righteous will be granted. The idea of the fear of the wicked, they're fearful of being caught. So the wicked is the fellow who steals. I'm afraid I'm going to get caught. The fellow who commits murder, they may find me out. The fellow who's doing secret sin, I'm afraid I'll be discovered. The fear of the wicked finally comes upon them. But the righteous, their desire will be granted to them. So there's blessings versus not being blessed. Verse 7, let's talk about the reputation. What do you learn from verse 7? Yeah, the righteous have a good name that's remembered, is basically what verse 7 says. But the wicked, not so. That's basically what verse 7 says. All right, let's go to the next, verse 27. In interest of time, that just basically says you have that wickedness does not promote a long life, righteousness does. We've talked about that principle before. 28 to 30, the hope of the righteous will be gladness, but the expectation of the wicked will perish. And so hope perishes for those who are wicked. Now notice verse 9. This is quite interesting to me at verse 9. He that walks with integrity walks securely, but he who perverts his ways will become known. Very similar to what we saw at verse 24 a minute ago. What's verse 9 suggest to you? Righteous versus the wicked. All right. Same principle, verse 24. Yes. He walks confidently. And so, I lost my verse. Verse 9. He that walked with integrity walks securely. He's confident of what he's doing. I'm not fearful of it being found out. I'm not fearful of being discovered. But the one who's in wickedness sometimes is fearful of discovery. All right, that's the righteous versus the wicked. So that's one pile of verses we put together. We have another pile of verses we put together that deal with lazy versus diligent. This is a reoccurring theme throughout Proverbs. So let's see what we find here. Look at verse 4. This deals with the results. What do you see at verse 4 about results? By the way, before we go any further, we need to stop and footnote. Proverbs, by the nature of the Proverbs, are general principles to which there may be exceptions. You agree with that? Like train a child in the way they should go, and then when he's old enough to depart from it. Are there exceptions to that? Ezekiel 18 says so. But generally true, you train the child right, they're going to go right. Well, the same thing is true here. So let's look at this result at verse 4. That he who deals with slack becomes poor. In other words, the lazy generally becomes poor. Are there any lazy people that become rich? Sure. They may inherit. And they're lazy as can be. They don't turn their hand to do a thing and they just got rich. Are there any people who are godly and righteous and work hard that become poor? Sure, that happens. But generally speaking, the lazy are poor, become poor, and the diligent and the wise become richer. And so the person who is industrious and they work hard and they gain, whether it's a lot or they just have sufficient, usually is using wisdom. Quite often those that are in poverty and stay in poverty are because they're not using wisdom. Make sense? It's a general proverb. You say, I know exceptions. Sure you do. Sure you do. That's the nature of it. Look at verse 5. The wise versus shame. What do you see at verse 5? Yeah, seizes the opportunity, and that's wise. But the one who doesn't, sleeps in the summer instead of gathering for the harvest, shameful. Now this is quite interesting at verse 26. Jump over to verse 26. This deals with laziness. And I think the point is laziness is detestable. As vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes, so is the sluggard to those who send him. Take that to mean the one who maybe is the boss, one who has hired the person, or whatever the case may be. You have sent the person to do the task, and they're lazy and they're sluggish and they don't do it. That's detestable as smoke in your eyes. It's irritating. And you can't, the boss hates that. The diligent worker despises that. We're not through with laziness. We're going to see this again and again and again and again throughout the Proverbs. Practical things to learn. All right, let's look at another pile of verses now. This is another reoccurring thought throughout the Proverbs, and that is the use and misuse of the tongue. Now, let's look at verse 11. The mouth of the righteous is a well of life, but violence covers the mouth of the wicked. What's that saying? All right. Yeah, one produces a well of life and the other produces violence. There's problems created by the tongue, and then there's encouragement and life, etc. Good things that come from the tongue. If we don't get another verse, let's get this, verses 19 and 18 and 19. To refrain is wise, but to utter slander is foolish. Let's get 18 and 19. This is, he who hides hatred has lying lips. The King James says he hides hatred with his lips. Now that is a question as to what the thought is. The one who hides his hatred, in other words, he has true hatred, but he hides it, has lying lips. The King James says he hides it with his lying lips. But anyway, and whoever spreads slander is a fool. That's not a contrast. That's saying the same thing, same kind of thing. So here's foolishness to utter slander and talk foolish. But I'm interested, verse 19. In the multitude of words, sin is not lacking, but he who restrains his lips is wise. Explain that verse for me. Finish my sentence. The more we talk, the more we are. Bingo. The one who refrains his tongue is wise, because they don't have many words they have to call back. They don't have much they have to apologize for. They don't have to often go say, I think I said too much. I think I uttered too much. I said some things I shouldn't have said. That's wisdom, to refrain, control. We're going to see that over and over again. Now back to verse 19. In the multitude of words, sin is not lacking. If you're one that just talks and talks and talks and talks and talks and talks, the chances are greatly increased you're going to say something wrong. Maybe sin by what you have to say. So there's the warning. Look at verse 20. The tongue of the righteous is choice silver, the heart of the wicked is worth little. I learned two things from that. All right? Good point. I learned that our words come from our heart. There's one thing I learned from verse 20. So what you just uttered tells me what you're thinking and what's really in your heart. It's not like I uttered those words, but that's not me. That's not what I was thinking. It tells me what's on your heart. But I learned this principle. The righteous person can utter words that are like giving out silver. It's valuable what they have to say. The wicked, on the other hand, say something that's worth very little. All right, let's go further. The righteous, verse 20, feed many. That's not the wording of the text, but the fool lacks wisdom. What I'm learning from verse 31 and 32 is, and verse 20 is, well, which we've already covered, verse 20, that the righteous with his tongue can feed and help many people with choice silver, but the fool just doesn't have any wisdom to utter. They don't have anything to share. They have no wisdom. That's why they are considered fools. Let's look at another pile of verses, or one verse. This is one verse in the pile. Verse 12 is hate versus love. What do you see at verse 12?
See how valuable love is in that context. There's no price you can put on that when someone's in sin. You love them, help them through it, help them forward instead of tear them down with hate and backbiting.
Yeah, look at, Stephen is exactly right. Love covers all sins. That does not mean that we're tolerant of sin. But as you know, in the case, if you love your mate and you love your children, you allow for mistakes because we're going to make mistakes. Love means you give the benefit of the doubt. 1 Corinthians 13 argues that. Where hatred is ready to zap and stir up trouble. So when there's a lack of love, which is what hatred is, that leads to trouble. But love gives the benefit of the doubt and it allows for mistakes and works through the problems and helps through the problems. We're not through with love and hate. We're going to see more about that. The rich versus the poor, verse 15. The rich man's wealth is a strong city. The destruction of the poor is his poverty, which says what? This is not a praise of richness, but it's a general statement that the rich have protection and security, and their riches are their protection and security. The poor are crushed and they're ill-treated because of their lack. General principle. You say, well, maybe that shouldn't be. That's not the point. The point is this is the way it is. Now let's get this section here. Finally, let's start with verse 1. This is concerning the wise versus the fool. So let's see if we can get some of these and we're going to be done. What do you see about the wise versus the fool in verse 1? A wise child makes their parents very happy when they make wise choices, do wise things, they're going in the right direction. The child that goes after foolishness brings sadness to the heart of the parent. That's what I'm learning from verse 1. Look at verse 8. I've got to talk about verse 8, and then I want to drop down to point E. Verse 8, let's get verse 8 and contrast that to verse 10. The wise in heart will receive commands, but the prating fool will fall. This is the one who receives, the wise receives instruction. We saw that in chapter 9. The wise receives their instruction, but the fool pushes it back. Now there's a contrast to verse 10. Verse 10, he who winks with the eye causes trouble, but the prating fool will fall. The ending of verse 10 is identical to the ending of verse 8. There seems to be a connection. There seems to be a contrast, wherein the wise receives instruction, and the one who winks causes trouble is one who doesn't receive instruction. So the fool doesn't take it seriously. Now, the Living Bible, today's Living Bible, or rather the Living Bible, translates verse 10 thus: winking at sin leads to sorrow, but reproof leads to peace. It may include the idea of winking with malicious intent, as chapter 6, verse 13 so instructed us. But I think it's the idea he doesn't take sin seriously. The fool doesn't take sin seriously, point E, but the one who takes sin and righteousness, everything seriously, he receives instruction. Does that make sense?
I think part of it, Donnie, kind of practical from that. One of them causes trouble for
Good point. Good point. Let's get one more thought here. Verses 13 and 14, point C, wisdom and understanding avoids destruction. Verse 14 particularly, wise people store up knowledge, but the mouth of the fool is near destruction. It's interesting that in wisdom and foolishness, he throws the mouth in there again. And perhaps it is saying that his mouth is always getting him in trouble. The fool's mouth will always get him in trouble, and constantly getting him in trouble, and he's got problems with that. The wise stays in the way versus verse 17, the fool is going astray. Now, we didn't cover every single verse, but hopefully that was helpful, putting them in categories. That's how we're going to approach Proverbs. Hope you'll pick out your own categories and then pick out key verses that stand out in your mind as being very helpful.